Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media Production. If you're new to the show, what we do here is talk about tips and tricks and hacks and tone and tuning and all that kind of fun stuff. And today, we're talking about bass drums, specifically vintage bass drums and kind of what they're all about. So first things first, that was a super broad statement. They're about a lot of things. There's a lot of brands, there's a lot of types, and today we're going to talk about the one vintage bass drum that I own, why I got it, what I use it for, and things to look out for if you're interested in going down this kind of vintage bass drum rabbit hole if you think it's something that you kind of need in your life. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario for being our presenting sponsor. Today we're doing Firegrain Rebound Acorn 5As and playing a bunch of styles and trying some different things. And what we have here is basically the only sort of alone, solo bass drum that I ever bought. I got it on Craigslist. It is a 60s round badge Gretsch. It's a 14-inch deep, 20-inch diameter, 60s. And it's super fun. I kind of got it on a whim because I didn't have a 20 and I kind of wanted something that I could leave full heads on both sides all the time and just use it for that kind of sound. And it's been a lot of fun, and I also learned a lot because it was kind of definitely my first Gretsch kit drum, apart from just snares and things. And it's a kind of a fun just thing to check out, especially if you're used to things that were made, recently and with different quality control, different materials, different vibe altogether. This is a sort of medium-sized bass drum. It's not super big. It actually makes a really big sound, which is kind of surprising to me. As you'll see, it's super versatile, and I kind of use it for one or two specific sounds, mostly in recording situations, and occasionally live if I know the room or if I know that we're going for a really certain kind of like vibey, old, boomy sort of sound. Specifics are we have coated G12s on both sides, and we're going with sort of no muffling. There's no muffling in the drum, but this drum is fitted with something called a Pratt muffler on the batter side, which is a adjustable felt strip muffler that can be drawn toward and pressed against the batter head with a knob on the outside of the drum. A lot of these older drums don't have them anymore. Either people took them out or something broke in it, something like that. This happens to have it intact, which is super useful because you don't have to take the drum apart to mess around with felt on the batter. I left the reso with nothing on it. We'll experiment with some minor muffling externally to show you where that's going to go in terms of tone if you need to kind of calm it down a little bit. But first of all, let's see what this sounds like with the Pratt engaged and with nothing on the front head. Right away, the things that I'm hearing are that it's boomy. There's some overtones in the bass drum mic for sure. And I'm also definitely playing off of the head to get as much of that tone as possible, which is sort of par for the course with using full heads on both sides, and doubly so if there's not some kind of robust muffling inside of the drum. There are a lot of things that have changed over the years, all sorts of stuff. They used to have cymbal mounts on the sides, myriad things. But the big thing is the legs. A lot of older drums, especially 60s drums and earlier than that, sometimes have straight extending legs out of the sides of the drum. And if you've ever seen that famous photo of Elvin Jones putting nails into the stage in front of his bass drum, this is what that's about. It walks away from you because there aren't legs pushing away from the player to sort of compensate for that pressure. So if you play hard, especially like he did, it's going to walk away from you. It's also why a lot of these older drums have been retrofitted with modern legs to just kind of stabilize them, basically. It's not a big deal, especially if you're not a collector or you're not super concerned about resale value if things like that have happened. It all depends on what you're into and what you're looking for. I left this as is, mostly because I use it for softer music. But that's the one big thing to be aware of. Thing number two is that the size, the literal diameter of the shells was somewhat variable back then. So some brands were a little undersized, some brands were a little oversized. Gretsch's from the 60s, a lot of them are a little oversized. So getting modern heads onto them can be a little bit of a struggle, regardless of brand. Some are harder than others, some are easier than others, and the drums also vary. This one happens to be pretty big, so getting the heads on is a little bit of a bear, but once they're on there, they kind of stretch and feel good, and they're fine after you do that. But it's definitely something to think about, especially if you get a drum and get spooked that you can't get it on. If you end up with a metric size drum, that's a different situation, and we'll talk about that another time. Now, the other big thing to talk about with older drums is the wood composition and also like the thickness of the shell, the edges. These are wildly variable. Camcos are different than Ludwigs. 70s Ludwigs are different than 60s Ludwigs. Every era of Gretsch is slightly different. There are a lot of mixtures of woods, poplars and mahoganies and, all those different things that get that sound. So, you can know about an era and you can know about a brand and kind of work within some parameters if you're looking for a certain kind of thing. But just know that there weren't a ton of just maple drums back then, and there weren't so many just mahogany drums or things like that. And they were doing that for a variety of reasons. Some of them sound, some of them just wood availability, all of that stuff, which is part of the fun because it really does mean that you can get a good set that's better than another set just because that day they had good wood. Who knows? Everything was a little looser back then, which is part of the fun for sure. Some older drums have issues like ply separation or the re-rings inside are coming off a little bit. A lot of that stuff can be fixed by solid builders these days, or people that do repairs and things like that. Our friend Steele at Kentville, for instance, is someone that does a lot of repairs and things like that. So, you can always take pictures if you're shopping, if there's any kind of damage, and talk to somebody about it. You might end up with a really great drum that just needs like a small fix or something like that. In terms of the actual shopping process, the definite things that I will do is make sure that I see it in person, that I talk to the owner a lot, try to get some history around it, and that I take the heads off, both to look at the edges and to check the inside to see if anything has been repaired, because if there are giant holes in the shell and they rewrap it, you're not going to know. And the owner might also not know. Maybe they left the original heads on there. This had the original front head on it when I bought it, so who knows? It's not necessarily about someone being malicious or trying to sell you something that's counterfeit. It's just knowing what you're getting. And the older the drum is, the more chances are that something happened to it. This one, for instance, had the consolette tom holder re-drilled to the center of the drum because this was in a double bass kit setup, if you can believe that. 220s that were 60s round badge Gretsches with rack toms and floor toms. It was a whole thing. I just bought the bass drum, but that means that there are some not original holes in this drum. It's not a big deal unless you're a collector. It doesn't really ruin the integrity of the instrument or anything like that. But just check all of that stuff, because the claws could be unoriginal, the screws could be unoriginal. It doesn't really matter as long as everything's intact and functional. So now that we've heard this drum the way that I normally use it, let's go through a couple of variables. We're going to disengage the Pratt muffler a little bit and kind of get the full wide open sound. And then we're also going to add a little muffling to the front head to deaden it a little bit, sort of in the vein of if I had a felt strip on the front head as well, which I do sometimes. So as you can see, just a little bit of adjustment actually yields a really different sound. It's a lot louder without the Pratt muffler just in the room, and it's much more controlled with just a little bit of foam pressed against the edge of the front head. It's a 20, so you really don't need a lot. Also, you can see from the single strike videos that burying the beater really, it crushes the tone out of it. If this was like a 26, you could probably get away with it because there's so much air, but especially with a modern beater and a modern pedal, you have an incredible amount of force you can exert with that. And it's really just going to defeat the purpose of going to the trouble of getting an instrument like this that has an intrinsic tonal quality that is different than just like a modern drum, you know? This is a good time also to talk about why I bought a 20 in the first place. To me, it's a very versatile size, particularly a 14 by 20. I like 14-inch depth for all sizes of bass drums. I feel like it yields the most tone and the quickest response for me. I have played a 12 by 20, which was also pretty cool, but I wouldn't go deeper than a 14 for something that I was going to own myself. A 20 is incredibly versatile, vintage or modern. It can do a lot, and it actually crosses the borders of styles and tuning ranges better than a lot of other instruments out there that claim to be versatile for different styles. You know, some people say you can play rock on an 18, and you can. You can play jazz on a 22, you can. But a 20, you can actually get really close to approximating authentic sounds, basically, in my eyes. And an awful lot of jazz was made on 20s. You know, 18s were not there at the beginning. It was a big sort of like downward spiral from the big drums in big band down to 18s and 16s like in the 60s and 70s. But all that to say, I personally recommend, if you're checking out a vintage bass drum idea or a vintage kit in general, a 20 is just a great place to go, both for versatility and also because they are the most common. 18s are more expensive, 22s are a little rarer in my experience, and 20s are kind of around. I found this one, there were several on Craigslist when I saw it. So summing up, vintage bass drums are fun. They can be a little cantankerous. They can have variables that maybe you're not expecting, so doing a little research is worth your time, definitely, and also thinking about what brand you might go after. You know, if you want a Gretsch sound, go after a Gretsch. You know, if you want a Camco, go after a Camco. Know your eras a little bit, and also think about what you want to use it for, because it may actually not be what you're after. There might be just like a sort of psychoacoustic or, you know, listening with your eyes kind of thing going on, which certainly has been the case for me with instruments in the past. So all that to say, go and check them out in person, play them, and if you find a great one and you can afford it, I mean, you really can't go wrong. They're super duper fun. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario for keeping us in the sticks, and please like, comment, and subscribe, and click that little button next to the subscribe button down there so that you get notifications when we put videos up. People still tell us that occasionally they are not getting those notifications, and that will make sure that you do. Also, there's going to be a little bit of extra stuff from this probably on the Patreon coming up, so head over there and check that out. We played some other things and tried some styles today and just sort of like stretched on the drum a little bit to see what it would do. And finally, tell me about your vintage drums. Tell me about your vintage 20s if you have them. Tell me if you play modern music on them, or if you only relegate them to stuff from the year that the drum was made or anything in between. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.